The year was 1871, a time of quiet unrest in the heart of post-Civil War America. Towns were rebuilding, churches were full, and yet something hung heavy in the air: grief, confusion, and spiritual longing. People had lost sons to war, daughters to illness, and faith to silence. The future seemed fragile. That's when the invitations began to arrive. They didn't come by train or official post. No, these letters were hand-delivered, often by anonymous messengers. Thin, silent men wearing black gloves and coats far too thick for the autumn air. They never spoke, never asked for payment, and never waited for a response. They simply knocked, handed over the envelope, and disappeared down dirt paths or across frozen fields before anyone could ask their name. Inside each envelope was a single piece of parchment, written in red ink so deep it looked like dried blood. The letters were identical: come walk the path of purification, leave your past behind, wear the veil, on the 77th sunrise you shall see God. There was no name, no return address, only a strange wax seal, a red open eye surrounded by flames. The recipients weren't random. Historians later discovered that each person who received the letter had something in common: deep personal loss or a crisis of faith. One had lost his wife in childbirth. Another was a young war widow. A third was a former preacher turned alcoholic. In total, 43 people across 6 states received the same message. People from Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, New York, and Kentucky. For most, it began as curiosity. They showed the letters to their pastors, who quickly dismissed them as cultish or evil. Neighbors warned one another, but the recipients felt something different. A pull, not just emotional, but spiritual. Some claimed they began dreaming of flames. Others said they saw figures in red robes standing in their cornfields or peering from the woods. Some claimed the letter wasn't a threat, it was a rescue. And so, in December of 1871, they vanished. They left behind homes, jobs, and families. No farewells, no arguments, no chaos. Just empty beds and red cloth left on kitchen tables. Some sold their belongings quietly. Others left notes: gone to meet him, pray for us. One man, James Silas, a blacksmith from Ohio, left behind a letter to his brother: this world is too loud, too full of false gods. I want silence. I want to see the real light, not the one filtered through men with agendas. They say he will meet us, and I believe it. They were seen traveling in small clusters, all wearing handmade crimson robes with veil, like coverings over their faces. Not one of them spoke publicly. They refused help from travelers, didn't rest at inns, and avoided towns. Instead, they walked through fields, back roads, and deep into the Appalachian wilderness. People began calling them the Red Veil Pilgrims. The sightings became more frequent. Farmers in rural Pennsylvania saw them singing quietly at sunrise. Children in Kentucky claimed to see women with no faces walking across frozen rivers. A train engineer swore he saw a group of them praying near the tracks before vanishing into the tree line. Local law enforcement was contacted, but there was no crime to investigate. These were adults, and as far as the law was concerned, they had the right to disappear if they chose. But that didn't ease the minds of those they left behind. Families began organizing search groups. They followed the rumors, tracked footprints through frozen forests, and sent letters to newspapers. But the trail always stopped in the mountains of West Virginia, near Elk River. After January 3, 1872, there were no more sightings. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. What began as a strange invitation had now become America's longest-running unsolved disappearance. But even more than that, it was a mirror. It reflected back the desperation, the hunger, and the willingness of good people to risk everything for a glimpse of hope, even if it came from a stranger's hand. Why did they follow it? Because when pain gets deep enough, any door that says salvation looks like a way out. Because grief can cloud your judgment. Because faith, when misplaced, becomes a prison. This wasn't a story of madness. It was a story of longing, loss, and the terrifying silence that follows when the world offers you nothing but more waiting. And in that silence, the letter offered something different: certainty. But the price of certainty was everything. The final chapter of the Red Veil Pilgrims' known journey ends where the land turns wild and the maps grow vague, deep in the mountains of West Virginia. By January 1872, the snowfall was thick, the rivers frozen, and the whispers of their movement had become eerie folk tales. Yet one thing remained clear: they were still walking, still searching, and still silent. They were last seen along the Elk River, near a settlement known then as Mill Hollow, a mining village barely clinging to civilization. Locals described them as a procession of crimson shadows, men, women, and even a few children, all cloaked in long red garments, their faces hidden behind veils. Some held hands, others carried only satchels and walking staffs. They made no noise, not even when approached or questioned. They were seen by a farmer, Thomas Creed, who watched them from the edge of his barn. His account, documented in a letter to his cousin, would become one of the most chilling first-hand observations. They moved like a funeral procession, but none wept. Their feet didn't sink into the snow. Their breath didn't steam in the cold. One woman stopped to look at me, though I couldn't see her eyes. I don't know how I knew, but I felt she pitied me. Word traveled fast, even in the rural mountains. Several townspeople formed a group to follow them, led by a Civil War veteran named Elias Morgan. Armed with hunting rifles and dogs, the group tracked the pilgrims for 2 days. But on the third morning, they were gone. Not just the pilgrims, but the trail itself. No footprints, no discarded items. No signs of fire or food. Just a clearing with a ring of melted snow, as if the ground had been warmed from beneath. In the center was a single crimson veil, folded neatly and weighted down with a smooth river stone. Elias, a man who had survived Gettysburg, never joined another search. He later wrote, "There are things in those woods that do not belong to man. We chased silence and it swallowed us. I don't think they meant to disappear. I think they were taken." Other locals were less poetic. One old trapper, Milo Black, claimed he saw red figures moving in the trees days after the official sightings stopped. He swore they weren't walking. They were hovering inches above the ground, gliding like dancers. Most dismissed Milo as delusional, but the fear in his eyes was real. He refused to hunt in that area again. Despite the superstition, formal investigations were launched. Sheriff Alan Royston of Kanawha County opened a missing persons inquiry. Over a span of 4 months, his team followed tips, searched caves, drained parts of the river, and even brought in Cherokee trackers. But not a single body, garment, or trace was found. By spring of 1872, the case was considered cold, and the missing 43 were quietly declared dead. But the people of West Virginia didn't forget. In fact, they built stories around the mystery, stories that grew darker with each generation. Children were warned not to stray into the woods lest the Red Veil pilgrims find you. Campers whispered about crimson lights flickering between the trees. One group of hikers in 1956 claimed they found a circle of smooth stones arranged in the forest, with one red ribbon tied around a tree. Their camera film came back blank. The disappearance was even investigated by paranormal researchers in the 1970s, who spent weeks in Elk River territory. One researcher, Judith Kells, documented hearing him, like humming, echoing through the forest at dawn. She left the project halfway through, citing emotional disturbances and recurring nightmares. To this day, no explanation has satisfied both believers and skeptics. Some say it was mass suicide. Others believe it was a cult that staged its own vanishing. A few even claim government involvement, suggesting the pilgrims stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to find in the mountains. But there's no evidence of any of these theories, only absence, and that's the real power of this story, the vacuum it leaves behind. No answers, no graves, no bones, just unresolved faith and the unsettling possibility that they walked towards something the rest of us were never meant to see. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't a monster or a ghost, it's people walking into the unknown with complete conviction. That kind of belief, even when misguided, reminds us how powerful longing can be. These were not lunatics or villains. They were people broken by life, daring to believe in something more. In their loss, there's a warning, but also, strangely, a kind of hope. It had been more than 4 decades since the Red Veil pilgrims vanished into the folds of the Appalachian wilderness. By 1914, their story had become more ghost tale than fact. An eerie bedtime story passed down by trembling elders in creaky wooden houses. but fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, had a way of resurfacing truth. That summer, two brothers, Jonas and Emery Clayton, were clearing brush near an old, abandoned logging path outside Whitaker, West Virginia. They were farm boys, no older than 16 and 20, sent to gather dry timber and mark trees for fall cutting. The forest in that region was known for strange fog and oddly warm breezes that slipped between the trees even in colder seasons. About 3 miles from the nearest cabin, Jonas stumbled on something buried under a thin layer of leaves and moss, a hollow, stout tree, long dead and half split by time. Inside, tucked deep into the center, wrapped in waxed cloth and sealed in a tin lunchbox, was a journal. At first, it seemed like a miner's logbook, but the moment they opened it, the smell of aged parchment and dried rose oil hit them, and then they saw the handwriting, neat, careful, and incredibly preserved. The first line read, "To whoever finds this, know that we walked not in fear, but in fire. This is my testimony." It was signed only M.D. What unfolded over the next 37 pages stunned everyone who read it, local officials, reporters, and eventually a historian from Charleston. The journal belonged to a young woman named Marian Devlin, one of the 43 Red Veil pilgrims who vanished in 1872. She was only 19 at the time of disappearance and had joined the group after her father died in a mine explosion and her mother succumbed to fever. Marian, like many others, had been drawn to a man called Elias Temple, the preacher whose sermons sparked the pilgrimage. Marian wrote about how Temple preached a coming veil between worlds that would open in the mountains. He spoke not of death, but of transformation. He promised healing to the grieving, clarity to the lost, and reunion with those who had passed beyond. She admitted they were desperate, each of them carrying wounds no medicine could mend. "We were not mad, we were mourning, and Temple spoke to that mourning like no man of God ever had." Her entries detailed the early journey, walking from Maryland through Pennsylvania and into the valleys of West Virginia. She described how their group moved silently, not as a ritual, but because words began to feel insufficient. They wore red not as a symbol of death, but of rebirth, the color of blood, passion, and sacrifice. She wrote of strange things too. Dreams shared between group members, animals that followed them for days without eating, nights when they would wake to find a soft red light hovering over their camp. "One night I saw my father in a dream. He didn't speak, but pointed toward the mountain. When I awoke, I knew the way we had to go, and Elias confirmed it. He had the same dream." Her final entry was dated February 17, 1872, the last known date of any sighting. The writing was shaky, the ink lighter. "We are here now at the pathless place. The trees no longer speak. The air is thick and humming. Elias says tonight we cross. Some are afraid. I am not. I saw the garden. I heard the singing. If I never return, let this be known. We were real, and we chose this. We chose love over despair. We chose to believe." When the journal was authenticated, it sent a tremor through West Virginia. Suddenly, the myth had a heartbeat. Marian Devlin was no longer just a name on a faded flyer. She was a voice, a soul. Her words were published in the Charleston Daily Gazette, and readers from across the country wrote in, some angry, some heartbroken, many deeply moved. The journal didn't solve the mystery, but it changed its meaning. No longer was the story just about 43 people vanishing. It was about what they were running toward, not madness, not suicide, but hope. Even now, the journal rests in the West Virginia State Archives, a fragile artifact from a forgotten time. Schoolchildren visit it on field trips, writers study it, and some nights, travelers still hike the Elk River trails hoping to feel what Marian felt, that pull towards something beyond this world. We often look at people who walk away from society with suspicion, but what if they're not escaping something? What if they're chasing something more true than we can understand? Marian's journal reminds us that faith isn't always logical, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk into the unknown with eyes wide open. Even if no one understands you, even if history forgets your name, your truth remains. In the spring of 1874, 2 years after the Red Veil pilgrims had disappeared without a trace, pressure on the state government had reached a boiling point. Families of the missing had lost patience with local sheriffs and half-hearted searches. Newspapers called it a spiritual migration gone tragically wrong. while others accused the state of ignoring the poor and grieving who made up the majority of the group. It was then that Governor Elias Thornbridge, under intense public scrutiny, announced the organization of a formal state-backed search party. It would be the last known coordinated effort to locate the pilgrims. Led by Captain Samuel Rourke, a war veteran known for tracking Confederate deserters during the Civil War, the search party consisted of 10 men, a mix of soldiers, trackers, and volunteers from the surrounding Appalachian counties. Among them was also a physician named Dr. Edwin Harrell, who believed the Red Veil pilgrims might be living in secret, suffering from spiritual delusions or illness. They set off on April 12, 1874, armed with maps, rifles, provisions, and horses. Their orders were simple: search the highlands northeast of Whitaker, especially around what locals called the Whispering Hills, a remote and fog-shrouded area of forestland that had long been associated with strange sightings, vanishing animals, and unusual echoes. Group's last confirmed contact was with a farmer named Hiram Blake, who provided them lodging for one night near the border of Fayette County. Blake reported that the men were in good spirits and determined to bring peace to the families who'd waited too long for answers. That was the last anyone ever saw of them. Weeks passed, then months. No word, no horses returned, no signs of struggle. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. A second team was considered but ultimately rejected. The state declared the men presumed dead in the line of public service. Captain Rourke's wife refused to accept it, publishing letters to the editor in every paper from West Virginia to New York City. In one editorial she wrote, "My husband survived Antietam. He survived Gettysburg. He would not have vanished in peacetime without reason." Some locals began whispering the unthinkable. Maybe the Red Veil pilgrims didn't want to be found. Maybe they were protecting something or someone. In 1891, nearly 2 decades after the failed search, a retired lumber surveyor named Jedediah Crowley donated his field equipment to a small museum in Charleston. Among the items was a hand-drawn map dated April 1874, labeled simply, "Trail Markers to the High Ridge Last Camp." The handwriting matched that of Captain Rourke. The museum dismissed it as a curiosity until a researcher noticed something strange. The landmarks didn't match any current topographical maps. In fact, several rivers, hills, and valleys listed on the drawing did not exist, at least not anymore. Geologists reviewed the area and discovered that a massive rock slide, likely triggered by heavy spring rains in the late 1800s, had shifted the landscape entirely. It meant one thing: the last known trail of the search party had been buried under time, stone, and silence. The most haunting clue came in 1926, when hikers in the Whispering Hills found a rusted revolver wedged into the roots of an overturned tree. Etched into the barrel were faint initials, SR. Beside the revolver, scratched into the bark of the tree, were 3 words, still with them: no bones, no camp, no clothing, just a single weapon buried like a tombstone with a message more mysterious than any grave. Today, the story of the search party is a staple of Appalachian folklore. But beneath the ghost stories lies a deep truth about duty, sacrifice, and unanswered callings. These 10 men didn't go looking for glory. They weren't seeking reward or fame. They went because they believed in accountability, in finishing what others had started. They went because they couldn't let a chapter like the Red Veil vanish from the conscience of a nation. And yet, in trying to solve one mystery, they became another. We often talk about heroes who return. But what about the heroes who don't? The search party that vanished reminded us that doing the right thing doesn't always end in recognition. Sometimes you won't get a thank you. You won't get a return trip, but you do it anyway, not because of reward, but because your conscience won't allow you to do otherwise. These men followed truth into the dark. Their disappearance wasn't a failure, it was a torch passed forward, and today we remember them not because they vanished, but because they chose to go in the first place. By the winter of 1876, nearly 4 years after the Red Veil pilgrims had disappeared, most of the town of Fair Hollow, West Virginia, had stopped speaking their names. The story had slipped into folklore, a bedtime whisper, a cold shiver during foggy nights, a warning told to children not to wander past the pine edge. But in a town that prayed more than it spoke, there was one place that never forgot: the First Emmanuel Church, whose old copper bell once rang every Sunday to summon the faithful. That bell had fallen silent ever since the Red Veil disappeared, until one icy January morning, it rang again. On January 4, 1876, just before sunrise, the town was startled awake by the tolling of the church bell, not once, not twice, but 12 slow chimes, as if counted out by some unseen hand. Sheriff Calhoun was the first to investigate. Alongside him was the elderly pastor, Father Jonas Talbot, whose own son had vanished with the pilgrims. They unlocked the church doors and climbed the winding stairs of the bell tower, expecting to find a prankster, a drifter, a bird, anything, but they found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no disturbed dust on the stairs, no rope movement, no wind, and yet the bell had rung. Word spread quickly. Older residents whispered that the bell only rings when something is coming home or something is trying to be heard. Days later, while inspecting the bell's suspension beam for faults, a carpenter named Jacob Rinsley found something strange. A loose panel behind the interior wall of the steeple, long covered in dust and lichen. Hidden behind it was a small, weathered box, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the letters R.V.P. Red Veil Pilgrims. Inside the box were two objects. One, a folded hymn sheet stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Two, a note in rushed handwriting. If you hear the bell, we are near. Our voices are still carried in the echoes. Do not forget us, lest we truly be lost forever. There was no name, no date, no explanation of how it got there. The discovery shocked the town. Who had placed the box there, when and why now? 4 years later, Father Talbot said, "I've heard men scream and deny heaven, but I've never heard the silence that deepened after this bell rang." In the following weeks, strange phenomena were reported by townsfolk who lived within earshot of the church. Children waking up humming hymns they had never learned. An elderly woman claiming to see a procession of figures in red veils walking silently past the church at dawn. A traveler who swore he heard crying inside the church, but found no one there. None of it could be proven, but the bell tower became something more than just a structure. It became a monument of hope and a memorial of unresolved grief. Some theorized that a member of the Red Veil had survived, returned secretly, and planted the box before dying. Others claimed it was a hoax, a local trying to stir up tourism or sentiment, but no one could explain how the bell rang without a pull or push or wind, and then something beautiful happened. After years of hiding from the pain, the town reopened the church. Father Talbot, who had once resigned from ministry in despair, began preaching again. He said, "If the dead are speaking, it's because we've grown too quiet." The church filled each Sunday. For the first time since the pilgrims vanished, townspeople sang the old songs, told their stories, and refused to let silence bury truth. Young men began to walk the hills again, not to search for remains, but to plant markers, crosses, and lanterns, saying, "If any of you still walk this earth, we are still here. You are not forgotten." The bell, oddly enough, never rang again on its own, but its single toll that winter morning had wrung open the hearts of a town once frozen in silence. We often think messages need to be shouted to be heard, but sometimes the loudest message is a single note in the quiet. The church bell rang not to frighten, but to awaken. It reminded a town that remembering is resistance, that grief is not weakness, and that hope is a form of strength. The Red Veil Pilgrims were never found, but in that moment, through a copper bell and a message hidden in the walls, they spoke again. And Fair Hollow learned that even if we don't understand the past, we must still honor it, because the echo of a life is only lost when no one listens. In the quiet corners of forgotten towns, hidden deep in the hollows of America's oldest forests, the story of the Red Veil Pilgrims still lingers, not as a ghost tale or a superstition, but as a timeless lesson wrapped in mystery. Decades have passed since the last official search party disbanded, and yet their disappearance remains one of the longest unsolved vanishings in American history. But the question remains, why does this story still matter? Why do people still talk about them? The answer is not just about mystery, it's about meaning. It's about who we are, what we fear losing, and what we fight to remember. The Red Veil Pilgrims were not just a group of wandering people. They were mothers and sons, teachers and carpenters, farmers and thinkers. They were people searching for clarity in a foggy world, much like many of us today. Their story resonates because it mirrors a human truth. that the search for purpose can sometimes lead us into isolation, but also into legacy. Though we don't know exactly what they believed or what happened to them, we do know they were committed to something greater than themselves. They weren't running from the world, they were in their own way trying to fix it, and that's what makes their disappearance so tragic and so inspiring. Most people don't fear death as much as they fear being forgotten, and perhaps, deep down, that's the quiet heartbeat of this story. The Red Veil pilgrims vanished without graves, without last words, without witnesses. But through every journal fragment, every church bell chime, every whispered sighting passed down through generations, they have not been erased. Their story reminds us that memory is powerful. When we choose to remember someone, we keep their voice alive. Even if the world tries to silence it, every person matters, every story matters, and when someone vanishes from the face of the earth, the way we honor their presence is by never allowing their absence to define them. At its heart, the Red Veil tale is not just about what happened to them. It's about what's happening to us. In an age where people disappear in metaphorical ways, through isolation, depression, rejection, or fear, this story becomes a metaphor for our own times. How many people today feel unseen? How many walk through life wearing their own version of a red veil? How many have left behind families, hopes, or dreams in search of something, anything, real? This story teaches us to look for those people, to not let others vanish without a trace, to be the sound that breaks the silence, the one who asks, "Where did you go? And how can I help bring you back?" After the church bell rang in 1876, Fair Hollow didn't just remember the pilgrims, they changed because of them. People came together again. They reopened long, abandoned spaces, reconnected with forgotten neighbors, relit lanterns not out of superstition but out of compassion. The Red Veil pilgrims taught them that loss doesn't mean surrender, and that silence can be interrupted by courage. The real ending of this story isn't disappearance, it's rediscovery. It's a small town finding its soul again, and if it could happen in Fair Hollow, it can happen anywhere. In a time where connection can feel thin, where noise is constant but meaning is rare, we need stories like this, not to scare us, but to wake us up. The Red Veil pilgrim's disappearance forces us to ask, what legacy are we leaving behind? What stories will outlive us? Are we listening to the voices that can no longer speak for themselves? It reminds us to listen carefully to the quiet people, the wandering souls, the isolated seekers. They may not ring church bells, but their presence still echoes. Though the Red Veil pilgrims vanished, what they represent is something that refuses to fade. The courage to follow conviction, the vulnerability of being forgotten, and the healing that happens when a community chooses memory over fear. So why does it still matter? Because they were human, because their search is still our search, because in remembering them, we remember a part of ourselves. Their final message, if we choose to see it, is clear. Don't let anyone disappear without love. Don't let purpose fade without witness, and never, ever stop listening for the echoes in your own life. That's why it matters, and that's why it always will.